Classical instrumental music is a very orderly repertory indeed. We have already seen that people had certain expectations about music, and they expected these expectations to be fulfilled. For example, they expected to hear certain kinds of music, certain musical genres in certain settings. We've already explored that. And when they listened to these compositions, they expected to hear a certain number of movements in each one of these compositions as well. Their expectations did not stop there, so let's go on to see what they could expect to hear when they sat down to hear individual movements. In fact, there are 4 different types of movement formats that classical audiences expected to hear as a part of a purely instrumental composition. And they even had the expectation of hearing each of these types of music in a certain position within those multi-movement works as well. Let's take a look at this phenomenon, and let's record what you learned from this experience in the table that is provided for that purpose. You can either use a printout of the table that you see above your podcast screen, or you can copy some sort of a table into your notes. The typical movement formats are represented on separate lines of the table, and there you already have the capital Roman numerals to indicate which one is the first, which is the second, which is the third, and which is the fourth. Please note that movements are indicated or labeled by means of capital Roman numerals. Now all you'll have to add to this table is the name of the movement format and the description that I give you of each of them. The first of these movement formats is called sonata allegro. Sometimes this movement format is simply called sonata, but I prefer this designation because it's a bit more precise. You don't have to worry about exactly why it is so. I will provide you with a nickname for each one of these movement formats, and I do believe that you will find them useful, so please do take note of them. When I think of sonata allegro, I think of typical first movement format, and there's a good reason for this. Every single multi-movement instrumental composition of the classical era always uses sonata allegro for its first movement, and this movement format could be used for any movement as well. So even though it could be used for any movement, please associate it in particular with the first movement and think of it as typical first movement format. The next movement format is called theme and variations. Now please remember that theme is the proper name for the main musical idea of a classical instrumental work, just as subject is the proper name for the main musical idea of a fugue, or ritornello is the proper name for the main musical idea of a ritornello principal concerto movement. When I think of theme and variations, I think of its typical position and its typical use as a second movement format. Indeed, if a composer does not choose to use sonata allegro format for this movement, 9 times out of 10 he will choose to use theme and variations for it. The next movement format is called minuet and trio. Let's take a careful look at this designation. Minuet is a French word that means smallish, and here it refers to the steps that the dancers made when they danced this particular dance. The minuet was the quintessential court dance of the late 18th century, and a stylized form of this dance was a standard part of late 18th and early 19th century symphonies and string quartets. By the way, the word trio refers to the central section of this composition, one that was usually played in actual social settings for social dancing or ballroom dancing, whatever you want to call it. That section of the dance was played by 3 instrumentalists. That's why it's called a trio. Calling minuet and trio typical third movement format is more than just applying a nickname to it. It is stating a fact. This fact, though, needs to be qualified by one thing, and that is that minuet and trio was used only in 4 movement forms. That is, it was used only in string quartets and in symphonies. And in fact, it was an absolutely standard choice for that movement in those genres. So remember its typical position, and remember that it was used only for 4 movement forms. The name of the next movement format is rondo, R-O-N-D-O, and you might have already guessed at its meaning. It means round. You will see how very apt this name is when we take a look at this movement format in detail. Now you probably are inclined to guess that the nickname for this movement format is typical 4th movement format, but it in fact is not typical 4th movement format. If you recall, there are both 3 movement and 4 movement forms in the classical instrumental repertory, and that the typical 3rd movement format, minuet and trio, is used only for 4 movement forms. That is why rondo is properly thought of as being typical final movement format, because rondo is used in both 3 movement and 4 movement forms. Indeed, if a composer does not choose to use sonata allegro for the 4th movement of a 3 or 4 movement composition, 9 times out of 10 he will choose this particular movement format, rondo. Now, I imagine that you might be a bit dazed by what we've done in the last few minutes. We've completed 3 tables, each of which dealt with some expectation that late 18th and early 19th century audiences had for the instrumental music of their time. And you already know how important the contents of tables are in this course. If I've taken the time to present it to you in an orderly fashion and asked you to copy a table of it into your notes, you know that it's going to be represented on one of the tests. In fact, when you take a look at the review pages for this unit, you will see that all of these details, concert versus domestic, 3 movement versus 4 movement, and the typical movement formats for all 4 of the movements, are very well rehearsed on those pages. It really is important for you to have the same expectations when you hear this music as were held by people of the time in which this music was written. Now, our next step will be to examine each one of these movement formats in detail. When we do so, you will notice that the first of them, sonata allegro, is the most complex. But despite its complexity, it's based on something that is very familiar to you, so it will not take you very long to master at all. Also, I have a bit of good news for you. The remaining 3 movement formats, theme and variations, minuet and trio, and rondo, all have something in common with types of music that we have already examined in some detail before, so I can describe each of them in only a few minutes for you. Basically, the bulk of the test for this unit will focus on the matters contained in the 3 tables that you've already completed, and on the details of each of these 4 movement formats that we're going to explore as we examine the repertory of the classical era.